From the US to Europe and here in Asia, many countries are looking to ease lockdowns and restart their economies. But there are also warnings of a second wave of infections. For a closer look, we're joined by Dr. Ramanan Laxminarayan from the Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics and Policy. Thank you very much, Dr. Ramanan, for joining us. First up, what has to happen before a government should actually consider lifting restrictions, though?
That's a tough question. So if you go back again to the first principles of a virus, this is a virus to which almost no one has immunity. So if you have one wave of infections, maybe 1 in 10 people gets infected, but you still have 9 in 10 people who have not faced the infection or potentially at risk. They are still susceptible to the virus. So the minute you remove the lockdown and allow things to go back to normal, then the epidemic curve will start picking up again. It's not magic. That's just how it happens. So the question is going to be how much countries are going to want to do repeated lockdowns as their primary way of controlling this epidemic, because the only other alternative is a vaccine, which is not going to arrive at least for another year. So we're in a difficult situation, and this in this during COVID and post-COVID world is going to be very unfamiliar, and there is no such thing as going back to normal for a very long time.
And what are some of the challenges for developing countries as opposed to those more developed nations?
I think the biggest challenge is really that there's just not enough space. And I think that's true in some developed countries as well, like Singapore, where some populations, migrant populations, might not have space to actually, physically distance in the case of a lockdown. So you're going to see a disproportionate number of infections amongst the poor because they're in close proximity to other people. And this is what happens for tuberculosis again, which is a respiratory pathogen. And lockdowns are not going to be as effective for many developing countries as they are for developed countries for this reason. So at best, we can slow down the epidemic, but it's not possible to completely have infections go down like you're seeing in Europe.
Right, but we do know that we are testing them to find out whether they have this disease or not. And that broadly, there are 2 types of tests available, the PCR swab test and the serological test. What's the difference between the 2, though?
So the 2 tests, the PCR test looks for virus in your body. It's a good test to do during the first week of infection when it's reasonably sensitive, which means it can show up, it can tell you whether you have the coronavirus in your body. After the first 10 days, it's pretty useless. After that, the test that you look for is what's called an antibody test, which looks to see if you have immunity to the virus. If you do not have immunity to the virus wouldn't leave your body in the first place. The reason why our bodies are able to clear the virus is because of our innate ability to have immunity. And there are many kinds of antibodies, but the ones we look for eventually are the long-term antibodies, which tell us our body now knows how to recognize this virus and deal with it in the future. So both these tests are important, one to figure out who needs to be hospitalized, who needs to go in for treatment, and the other to figure out if someone's been exposed, how many people have been exposed, and whether we're safe to go back to work.
Well, how do authorities decide then which type of test is best suited for their use?
I think both have a purpose and for different purposes. I think the PCR test, which is more expensive, more difficult to scale because the capital cost is high and the cost per test is high, is essential. That's what most people refer to as testing, which is it requires these nasopharyngeal swabs, which involves sticking a swab right to the back of someone's nose, literally stabbing them in the back there. And it's not an easy test to do. It requires trained personnel, but it's important to figure out who goes in to hospitalization. The test is done better, and now you can say this person has immunity. We don't know how long, but at least they've had the infection, and therefore they don't pose as great a risk to other people now that they've cleared the infection.
Many thanks for your thoughts this evening, Dr. Ramanan Laxminarayan from the Center for Disease Dynamics, Economics and Policy.